I call on the representative of Ethiopia.
Mr. President, we ask for the floor in the exercise of the right of reply to the statement made by the Egyptian delegate against my country, Ethiopia. The unfounded claims we heard here today are also communicated to the Security Council. Ethiopia has provided a considered response based on truth and lessons from our knowledge of Egypt's baseless claims. Our position remains principled and clear. The Nile River ties Ethiopia, Egypt, and the 9 other countries of the Nile Basin with a natural bond. Ethiopia has taken all steps to preserve this bond. The contrast between Ethiopia's long-standing policy of cooperation and Egypt's continued hostility is starkly clear. Ethiopia abides by the international law principle of equitable and reasonable utilization in its use of the Nile River. Egypt, on the other hand, is invested in imposing what it calls its historic right. Ethiopia advances basin-wide cooperation along with its sisterly co-riparian countries. Egypt pushes for colonial-era bilateral commission that grants it unfettered authority over 10 African countries. Ethiopia seeks to develop the water to protect the human rights of our people for an adequate standard of living, to ensure access to clean drinking water, food, and electricity to power our homes, schools, hospitals, and factories. Egypt insists on denying them these necessities of life by a perpetual colonial status as a desert farm, to use its own terms, and I quote, oasis for development, end of quote. Ethiopia built the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam by consulting and involving Egypt in the decision-making processes, starting from the design to the operation of the dam. Egypt built the humongous High Aswan Dam, which is nearly 3 times the size of our Renaissance Dam, destroying the Nubia and Meroe civilizations, with flooding destroying the livelihood of people in its neighbor. Several rounds of negotiations have been held between Ethiopia and Egypt. Egypt tried to extract unreasonable concessions from Ethiopia without any genuine desire for a win-win solution. Egypt's representatives have not shown any inclination to produce a consensus outcome. Its entire focus is to get other Nile riparian states to recognize its claims for colonial-era entitlements and full control of the Nile. Ethiopia's dam is the first of many, not only in Ethiopia, but also in the wider Nile Basin region. There has to be a lesson from the past to chart a positive future, a more collaborative future. Hostility only breeds divisions, wastage of resources, and missed opportunities for joint development. Ethiopia has redoubled its efforts to ensure regional peace and security, shoulder to shoulder with its neighbors, to restore peace, advance integration, and economic development, and in the fight against terrorism. Egypt, on the other hand, is disrupting these regional efforts, shipping in arms and supporting belligerents and making diplomatic solutions impossible in its neighbors to the south and west. There is no parallel comparison between my country, Ethiopia, and Egypt. Our determination to forge cooperation emanates from the just nature of our cause and action. It's influenced by the timeless bond and shared future we enjoy with our neighbors. When we exchange this word in this August Assembly, it is only because we are compelled to do so. Egypt's attempt to internationalize one hydroelectric dam, one African river, is only another case of exploiting this platform for narrow political purposes and a cover-up for national and regional preoccupations. This is one among several factors that contributed to the challenges the United Nations is facing in developing on its mandates. We thus encourage Egypt to play a constructive role in building a future of shared prosperity I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, President.
On the representative of Egypt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for giving Egypt the floor in order to exercise the right of reply against the allegations by the Ethiopian delegation. First of all, our stance regarding the Ethiopian dam is very clear and was stated by our Minister of Foreign Affairs this afternoon in the general debate. The Ethiopian dam represents a unilateral measure devoid of any legal legitimacy, and Egypt stresses that despite all the flimsy efforts to give the Ethiopian dam a false veneer of acceptance and legitimacy, the dam remains a unilateral measure that violates international law and norms and doesn't produce any consequences that would affect the legal system governing the Eastern Nile Basin under international law. Furthermore, the recent Ethiopian actions represent a new violation, adding to a long list of Ethiopian violations of international law, including disregard for the presidential statement issued by the Security Council on September 15, 2021. Having said that, Mr. Chair, allow me also to reply to the false allegations by the Ethiopian representative. Egypt categorically rejects all the false allegations made by the Ethiopian representative in response to the Egyptian statement during the GA debate in this afternoon. The Ethiopian side must first reflect and look at itself if it wants to identify those who are truly undermining stability, peace, and security on the continent. Ethiopia is the one that signed a memorandum of understanding that threatens the unity and sovereignty of Somalia, a sister African state, by recognizing a secession of its territorial integrity. A state that repeatedly attacks the Sudanese Fashaqa and illicitly exploits its resources. This is Ethiopia, not Egypt. A state whose forces were rooted out of UNISFA peacekeeping mission. This is Ethiopia, not Egypt. A state that waged a war against Eritrea and sieged it for years and still threatens it by a new war to achieve its delusions of access to sea. This is Ethiopia, not Egypt. A state that operates forces in Somalia outside the AU banner. This is Ethiopia, not Egypt. Ethiopia, which violates the established rules of international law and disregards the established African principle of sanctity of borders, believes it can control the Nile waters and deprive the downstream countries, Egypt and Sudan, of their historical right to the river's waters. Ethiopia must stop immersing itself in illusions of power and control and realize that its false accusations are nothing but fabrications and delusions stemming from a troubled internal situation that seeks to export its internal problems and create imaginary enemies for domestic consumption. Stable and civilized Egypt rises above this abhorrent approach. We call on Ethiopia to exercise wisdom, cease threatening its neighbors, and refrain from any measures that destabilize the continent. We call on Ethiopia to return to the African family as a pillar of peace and stability in the region, not as a threat or underminer. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
I now call on the representative of Ethiopia for a second intervention.
Mr. President, Egypt has once again made additional baseless allegations against my country, most of which are refuted by Ethiopia's previous statements and replies before this August Assembly. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is complete, and it was inaugurated on September 9th this year. This is a fact. The dam is generating electricity. It has brought immense satisfaction for Ethiopians, people of the Nile River Basin, Africans across who aspire the continent's development and prosperity, unlike what the Egyptian delegate falsely described in his intervention just now. The dam is also a symbol of resilience and determination in the face of obstacles advanced by Egypt to prevent Ethiopia from getting the financial resources necessary to build the dam. Ethiopians from all walks of life mobilize resources from their own savings to contribute to the $5 billion hydropower project. Ethiopia firmly believes in the peaceful settlement of disputes. Ethiopia initiated talks with downstream countries, provided them with the necessary details about the dam, and gave them updates on the progress in the filling of the dam. It signed the agreement on the Declaration of Principles on the dam project to agree on guidelines and rules on the first filling and annual operation of the dam. Ethiopia's conduct, in fact, reversed the age of unilateralism in the Nile River basin that has been advanced by Egypt. Our efforts to find a mutually agreeable solution have been stymied by Egypt all the way. Egypt has hardly negotiated in good faith. Reaching an agreement has never been Egypt's objective. If it had been interested in collaborative approach, it would have joined the agreement on the Nile River Basin Cooperative Framework, which came into force on 13th October 2024. Nevertheless, Egypt wants a monopoly. In this century, that's not possible. The days of hegemony and colonial agreement are over. Egypt propaganda must stop its reckless threats. Countries sharing such a precious resource as water are not expected to propagate hostility. If Egypt is interested in genuine cooperation, it will find Ethiopia as a partner. Ethiopia remains hopeful to reinvigorate relations among all riparian countries of the Nile Basin based on the genuine desire for collaboration in joint development. I thank you, Mr. President.
President.
I call on the representative of Egypt for a second intervention.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, once again for giving Egypt the floor. Mr. Chair, we are not willing to dwell more on the continued fallacies posed by the Ethiopian delegation. However, we are going to reiterate our position and stance. We affirm Egypt's firm position of rejecting all unilateral Ethiopian measures on the Nile River and not accepting them or their consequences for the existential interests of the peoples of the downstream countries, Egypt and Sudan. Ethiopia is adopting intransigent positions seeking to impose a fait accompli driven by a political agenda, not development needs, to mobilize the Ethiopian interior against an imaginary enemy under the pretext of false claims about sovereignty over the Nile River, which represents the shared property of its riparian states. Since the unilateral launch of the Ethiopian dam project and over the past years, Egypt has exercised the utmost restraint and chosen to resort to diplomacy and international organizations, including the United Nations. This is not due to an inability to defend our existential interests, but rather stems from Egypt's firm conviction in the importance of strengthening cooperation and achieving common interests among the peoples of the Nile Basin countries, in accordance with the international law, and in a manner that serves development interests and takes into account the concerns of downstream countries. And hereby, Mr. Chair, we continue to maintain the right to reply to the illegal Ethiopian unilateral measure by all the necessary means enshrined in the international law and the UN Charter. I thank you, Mr. Chair.